Yes. Great. The subcommittee will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on the U.S. visit exit, closing the gaps in our security. And in the interest of time, because I hear we're going to have votes called in about half an hour, what we'll do is go quickly through our opening statements and give the time for you all to give your opening statements. I think right about that time they'll be calling the vote, and that's probably why we don't see too many members here right now. Then we'll come back to take questions. Thank you, first of all, to our witnesses for being here today for U.S. visit exit, closing gaps in our security. The U.S. Visit and Immigration and Immigrant Status Indicator Technology, or what we call U.S. Visit program, was created in 2003 to meet multiple congressional mandates, actually, which date all the way back to 1996, that required an automated entry-exit data system to track foreign nationals entering the United States and to detect individuals who were overstaying their visas. And the 9/11 Commission stated that completing this biometric-based entry-exit system was an essential investment in our national security. And this point was illustrated by the fact that 7 terrorists that committed the crimes between 1993 and 2001, including 4 of the 9/11 terrorists, were actually illegal in the United States because they were overstaying their visas. Unfortunately, 4 years after the creation of U.S. Visit, the exit component has not been implemented. And I understand that the Department of Homeland Security is starting to talk about implementing the U.S. Visit exit component for air travel. However, Congress has yet to see detailed plans for this rollout, and there are significant concerns about the degree of consultation between the Department and the airlines in designing this component of U.S. Visit. And I would urge the Department to review the recent Committee on Homeland Security Majority Staff Report entitled America's Unfinished Welcome Mat, U.S. Visit a Decade Later. The report highlights the legislative mandates and the ongoing challenges of the U.S. Visit and what it has faced in implementing a biometric entry-exit system. And in addition, the report and many reports by the Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, make recommendations for improving the operation and the implementation of U.S. Visit's biometric entry-exit system at air, at sea, and at land ports. We need to ensure that the exit component is implemented in an efficient manner that complies with the recommendations in these reports and that minimizes the negative impact on international travel and on our commerce. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion. I think it's an incredibly important one, especially as America grapples with who's coming in and out of our country and how do we take care of this big issue in particular of people overstaying their visas. So I thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to your testimony, and I want to thank our ranking member right now, Mr. Bilirakis, for being here, and I will give him time for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it very much. I'd like to read actually Ranking Member Souter's statement. The ability to reliably screen, identify, and track foreign nationals in the United States is essential for border security. I have been a supporter of the U.S. Visit program from the beginning. I voted for 6 different laws that address the national entry-exit system because I think that it is critical for the integrity of our immigration and border management system to have this capability. The primary focus of the hearing is the Department's inability to implement an exit system for the U.S. Visit program. There are clear security vulnerabilities, and not knowing who has overstayed their visa and the consequences are stark. Terrorists have exploited this security vulnerability to remain in the United States to carry out and plan attacks, including 2 of the co-conspirators in the first World Trade Center attack, 1 of the figures from the New York subway bomb plot, and 4 of the 9/11 terrorists. Without a land exit system in place, we are giving terrorists a 6,000-mile loophole. I'm extremely concerned that there is no exit system in place a year after the legal mandate, a year and a half after the legal mandate. And there doesn't appear to be any plan in place to get there. I would like to commend the U.S. Visit Program Office for the tremendous job of standing up the biometric entry system in accordance with the statutory guidelines and requirements. The previous administration ignored the program from 1996 to 2000. After 9/11, the speed at which the entry program was established shows the capability of the United States when resources and political will are dedicated to a problem. I want to see the same desire for an exit system. The bottom line is that the Department's inability to implement U.S. visit-exit, as well as other border security programs such as the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, is prophetic of management and implementation problems that would befall any amnesty or guest worker program currently being debated in the Senate. I understand they did not get cloture. If the federal government cannot gain operational control over the border and implement a functional border management system, it is doubtful that a massive amnesty program could be developed that wouldn't overload the agencies and throw the system into chaos. I look forward to the testimony today and hearing about the status and plans for U.S. visit. I would like to thank the witnesses for being here and express my appreciation to the chair for holding this hearing. I yield back, and I do have an opening statement a little later when we get to the questions, if that's okay, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Great. I thank the gentleman from Florida.
Florida, correct.
The gentleman from Florida. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record, and I welcome our first panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Robert Mockney, who's the director of the U.S. Visit Program, and in that capacity, he is responsible for the day-to-day operations of U.S. Visit, including managing the development and the deployment of the program. Our second witness is Mr. Robert Jackstra, Executive Director for Traveler Security and Facilitation at Customs and Border Protection's Office of Field Operations. You say that each and every time? In that capacity, he is responsible for implementing passenger programs to combat international terrorism and smuggling, specifically those related to processing passengers entering and exiting the United States. And our third witness is Mr. Randy Height, Director of Information Technology, Architecture, and Systems Issues at the Government Accountability Office, where he is responsible for GAO's work on information technology issues across the government concerning architecture and systems acquisition, development, operations, and maintenance. Welcome to all of you, and without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Mockney.
Thank you, Madam Chairman Sanchez and Ranking Member Bilirakis. We appreciate the invitation to be with you today to talk to you about how U.S. Visit is, in fact, improving our nation's security. Let me also say how pleased I am to be joined by my colleague, Bob Jackstra from Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, with whom we work on a daily basis to protect our nation's borders. And I'm also pleased to be here with Mr. Randy Height of the Government Accountability Office. Randy has been focused on the U.S. Visit Program since 2001, actually before U.S. Visit became U.S. Visit Program, and he's offered his constructive recommendations to improve how we do our business. Biometric exit control is a priority for securing our nation's borders. You have said so. The 9/11 Commission has said so. The Secretary of Homeland Security has said so. We at the Department of Homeland Security and U.S. Visit in particular are working every day to meet this mandate and make our nation more secure. Today, biometrics provide DHS with an additional tool to match biographic records that might otherwise go unmatched. Merging biographic and biometric information holds the greatest promise to close the matching gap and ultimately close the door on those persons who seek to exploit holes in our immigration system. Biometrics are a critical component to achieving broad success in an exit control system. During the last 3 years, DHS has conducted significant planning and testing looking at possible solutions for integrating U.S. Visit biometric exit requirements into the international air departure process. U.S. Visit conducted biometric exit pilots at 12 airports and 2 seaports, some starting as early as January 2004 when U.S. Visit was first launched. By the time we completed our testing of biometric exit technology and procedures in May 2007, we had learned an important lesson. The technology works and works well, but the procedures did not. Traveler compliance with the pilots was low. Unlike entry, with no infrastructure in which to embed exit procedures, travelers had to change their behavior independently. Our final evaluation of the pilot determined that to achieve 100% compliance, biometric exit procedures need to be incorporated into what travelers are already doing, into the current processes for international travel. Based on the pilots and other potential options, DHS has determined that U.S. visit air exit should be incorporated into the airline check-in process. This option will minimize the impact on legitimate travelers and dramatically improve compliance. We know that DHS's proposed solution requires significant outreach and partnership with the airline industry, and the department has begun that outreach. In order to minimize the carrier impacts, DHS proposes providing a single interface to air carriers for meeting U.S. government passenger data requirements. This will ensure that airlines would not be sending multiple or duplicative data sets to DHS for the same person. DHS is also considering technical and financial assistance for air carriers to assist with initial implementation. In deploying biometric exit procedures, U.S. Visit will prioritize the departure airports based on volume and destinations of travelers departing the United States. Since more than 91% of all travelers from countries of interest arrive in the United States by air, an effective biometric exit process is essential to assessing risk and enhancing the integrity of our immigration and border management system. DHS plans to publish a notice of proposed rulemaking outlining the department's approach to implementing biometric air exit procedures by the end of this calendar year, with a final rule published by June of 2008 and final execution by December of 2008. The same basic protocols will also apply to the cruise lines as well. As you know, the land border ports pose unique challenges of their own. DHS continues to research options and cost estimates that will meet our goals without a negative impact on the economy and the environment or traveler safety. In the short term, exit procedures at land ports cannot be based on biometric solutions. The scope and complexity are simply too great. While we continue our search for solutions, DHS will instead seek to match records using biographic information in instances where no current collection exists today. A comprehensive, long-term traveler exit security strategy for the United States is an exceedingly complex and costly challenge. It is a challenge subject to change due to fluctuating terrorist threat levels, evolving supporting policies, and developing technologies. In order to meet this challenge, DHS must seek new technologies and modernize facilities, establish new levels of inter- and intra-governmental cooperation, and identify and commit significant investments. DHS is relying on the dedicated women and men of U.S. Visit and their proven track record of success to get the job done. And although the challenge of creating a biometric exit system is complex, we are prepared to meeting this head-on. I hope you will continue to support our efforts. Thank you, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
Please.
Good afternoon, Chairman Sanchez. Good afternoon, members. I am pleased to be here today to let you know what the Department of Homeland Security is doing, as well as Customs Border Protection is doing at our ports of entry to protect the United States. I would like to begin by recognizing the very good, close working relationship that we have with U.S. Visit over the years. We have been able to implement U.S. Visit at our ports of entry, and it is a very valuable tool to our officers today. As you know, CBP has an enormous challenge. We share more than 7,000 miles of border with Canada and Mexico and operate 325 ports of entry. Each day, CBP officers inspect more than 1.1 million travelers arriving at our ports of entry, and we examine the documents, their baggage, and their vehicles. Last year alone, CBP welcomed over 422 million travelers through their official ports of entry. During fiscal year 2006, CBP processed a record 87 million passengers arriving from abroad by air. However, in this largely compliant group of travelers, CBP denied entry to more than 209,000 inadmissible visitors and seized 646,000 pounds of illegal narcotics. To address this challenge, CBP has implemented a smart border strategy to provide security and enforce U.S. laws both at and between the ports of entry, as well as extending our security zones beyond our own borders. A key component of this strategy at our borders is to use advanced electronic information and an automated risk management system that identifies and targets high-risk travelers well before arrival in the United States. Advanced information regulations were initially implemented under the Aviation and Transportation Security Act of 2001 and the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Reform Act of 2002. On April 7, 2005, the APIS final rule was published in the Federal Register, requiring manifest information from all commercial air and sea carriers arriving into or departing from the United States. This manifest information includes the name, date of birth, document type, document number, and gender of all arriving and departing passengers and crew. The Advanced Passenger Information System has become a critical tool in securing our nation's borders and increasing the facilitation of legitimate air and sea travelers. CBP is continually evaluating the data, and by working with the airlines and vessel industry, has achieved improved advanced information compliance. The current inbound and outbound APIS transmission compliance rate is over 99%. The Arrival and Departure Information System within DHS is a system that can be used to match non-U.S. citizen arrival records with departure records. The current non-U.S. citizen match rate is 93%, and the current Visa Waiver Program country match rate is close to 96%. To further our security, and after extensive consultation with the U.S. and international airline partners, DHS has also published a pre-departure notice of proposed rulemaking on July 14, 2006. This proposed rule offered two options for carriers to transmit passenger data to DHS in a manner sufficient to allow DHS to screen all international travelers prior to their departure. Specifically, air carriers can transmit complete manifests prior to departure, or they can transmit passenger data as individual, real-time transactions as each traveler checks in. When the rule is finalized and implemented, the United States government will take on the watch list screening responsibilities for all travelers arriving into or departing from the United States aboard a commercial aircraft or vessel. In addition to receiving advanced passenger information, CBP also uses technology to screen travelers and goods at our ports of entry for weapons of mass effect. CBP officers also screen high-risk travelers at selected foreign airports locations throughout our Immigration Advisory Program. Finally, CBP has developed a training program for air carrier personnel and their security screenings on fraudulent document detection and imposter recognition through our Carrier Liaison Program. Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee, I appreciate this opportunity to testify before you, and I can assure you that CBP will remain vigilant on the war against terrorism, both at our nation's ports of entry, and will continue to add appropriate additional layers of security overseas. At this time, I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have today.
Thank you. Mr. Haidt, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by commending the subcommittee for holding this hearing on that side of U.S. visit that can best be described as an enigma, namely U.S. visit exit. As your opening remarks indicated, U.S. visit is supposed to be two-sided, meaning it is to have both an entry and an exit capability. The good news is that entry is operating at almost 300 ports of entry, as well as over 200 visa issuing posts. And these capabilities have prevented illegal visitors from coming to our country and have arguably deterred others from trying. The bad news is that the other side of U.S. visit, namely exit, is not operating anywhere. The question thus becomes, why is this the case with U.S. visit exit, and what are the prospects for this changing anytime soon? My written statement addresses this question, and I will summarize it by first quoting the Spanish philosopher who said, "Those who ignore the history are doomed to repeat it." As our previous reports chronicle, the history of U.S. visit exit shows a pattern of inadequate definition, planning, and justification around the solution to be pursued and how it is to be pursued. As a result, 4 years of activity and $250 million in allocated funding has yet to produce an operational exit capability. As of today, I have not seen evidence that this has changed in any significant way, and in fact, everything seems to be pointing to DHS ignoring and thus repeating its history on U.S. visit exit. In particular, the latest U.S. visit expenditure plan calls for investing $27 million on an unspecified air and sea biometric exit solution and suggests that this is just the beginning. However, similar to the past, it is yet to produce either the plans or the analyses that adequately define and justify exactly what it intends to do and deliver by when, much less how it intends to deliver it. Rather, DHS is repeating history by making general statements about fully implementing undefined biometric exit capabilities at airports either in 2008 or 2009, depending on what planning document you look at, engaging with airlines in some yet-to-be-defined manner but nevertheless saying it will issue a proposed federal regulation requiring airline participation by the end of this year, and replicating at seaports whatever this airport exit capability turns out to be. To quote the Major League Baseball icon Yogi Berra, this is like deja vu all over again. As we have stated many times, successfully delivering a cost-effective U.S. visit exit capability depends in large part on having adequate plans and justification governing the solution to be acquired and deployed. Without it, the chances of success are not good. In closing, I believe it was Ben Franklin who said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. In my view, it is not reasonable for the Department to continue taking the same undefined and unjustified approach to U.S. visit exit and expect that the outcome will be any different than it is today, namely no operational exit capability despite 4 years and $250 million. Accordingly, I would urge the Department to approach its latest attempt in delivering long overdue exit capabilities in the kind of rigorous and disciplined fashion that our prior recommendations embody. Until it does, the prospects of a cost-effective, operational, biometrically enabled exit capability will be diminished, which in turn holds consequences for DHS's ability to perform its border security and immigration enforcement missions effectively and efficiently. For example, the absence of an exit capability means that important data are not available to DHS's Immigration and Customs Enforcement Organization in targeting its limited resources to identify and remove foreign nationals who have overstayed their visas. With that concluding thought, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Haidt. I actually am going to give myself a couple of minutes to ask a little series of questions and then turn it over to Mr. Bilirakis for his 5 minutes. You just mentioned $27 million on an unspecified plan. Can you go into more detail on what that's about?
The $27 million that I was referring to was cited in the fiscal year 2007 U.S. visit expenditure plan. $20 million of that is a carryover from prior years. 7.3 of it is fiscal year 2007 money. The expenditure plan allocates the 7.3 to broad categories of activity like project management and contractor services. The $20 million is not allocated to anything specifically in that plan.
And what you're saying is this is money that's sort of been put in a pile that they're going to use on the exit part of U.S. visit, but we're not able to ferret out any detailed plan of what that plan for exit was.
Exactly. Based on the documentation that's been made available to us, either the expenditure plan or other documentation that we've been provided.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mockney, do you have a plan?
We do have a plan. The time that we put that document together, the plans were still in formulation, but we do now have a very detailed set of actions that have to occur between now and December of 2008 in order for us to successfully implement that. So where that information is just making its way up here to Congress, at the time we put that together, it was not as defined as it is now.
Is it a written plan?
We have written plans, various iterations of the written plan. The way we work over at U.S. Visit, we're very project-focused, so we put together a business plan, what we think needs to happen. We put those down in a document. We end up with a Gantt chart of activities that have to be clicked off as we do that. I think what was recognized earlier was the implementation of entry was done successfully on time and on budget, and we would make that same approach to exit as well. The same people and the same processes would be in place to do that. It is deciding what that is that we want to implement. Now we've decided what we want to implement for exit. Now we follow our established plans.
And you're sending this packet, I'm assuming, because what you've just told me, it's sort of in different pieces. It's not really in a binder all together. This is the plan, etc. You're sending those pieces over to Congress when? When do I get my hands on these little documents?
We have submitted to you, I believe, this morning in response to Chairman Thompson's request in his letters. He asked some very specific questions about what we're going to do, and whereas it won't be a great deal of detail within response to those letters, it is indicating that we do have a plan and that we have activities that we know we have to do in order for us to be successful by
well, you just said it's not in great detail what you're going to submit because of Mr. Thompson's letter. Do you have a plan, or don't you have a plan?
We have a plan. We do.
You have a plan, and it's a written plan.
It's a written plan.
It's a plan that if I picked it up would be 38 pages or 458 pages, and it would have objective, timeline, money to that, what you're trying to do, what if you fall behind schedule, a real plan?
Yes, it does. But I want you to understand that we also have to do an NPRM. We have to work with the airlines. And so where we have a plan to, and as we said, make this part of the check-in process, we now have to have the conversation with the airlines to work out what
Have you
the
had that
details are.
conversation with the airline?
We've begun the conversation.
When did you begin the conversation?
We've had actual conversations over the course of the last couple of months, but we have to do that formally through the NPRM process. And that
You've
will
had
be published.
informal conversations with the airlines.
The airline community, specific airlines, but also with ATA, the Air Transport Association, excuse me, but also the International Air Transport Association as well.
Over the last 2 months, that's when you began these. When did you put the plan together?
The plan has been evolving over the course of the last several months, and it was.
But it relies on the airline, at least the piece at the airports relies on the airlines.
That's correct.
So you started talking to the airlines within the last 2 months, but you started making this plan without the airlines several months before?
We put parts of the plan together based on the pilots that we ran. We understood that it had to be part of the traveler's experience. We looked at several options, and we understand that the check-in process can offer us the most optimum set of locations where the airlines can take the biometric and give it to us. So we based a lot of our plan on our own experience that we've been running for the past 3 years. And in that course, working with the airlines as well. The airlines had to participate as far as the pilots were concerned. They had to direct individuals to find these kiosks. The airports had to provide signage. And so where in some cases that worked very well, other cases it did not. We took those 3 years' worth of experience and then put that together in a plan, an outline of a plan that will evolve, and as plans do. It will get more detailed as we move further along the way, as we work with the airlines, as we engage them and listen to them as to what their business model is for the check-in process. And so that plan becomes more and more detailed. Again, the formal process is with the NPRM process. We get their comments. We kind of ratchet that into the whole project plan. That changes some of the elements of what we have to do. At the end of the day, though, we have to implement something with the airlines.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For 5 minutes or whatever you want to say, questions you want to ask.
I apologize for missing the opening statements. I had a few questions regarding the land border, and I'm not sure who best answers this. If I say, which we encourage millions of people to do, and millions of people do, and I'm not criticizing this, but if I say I'm in Juarez, and I say I'm going to El Paso for dinner, do we have any plans to see whether you went to El Paso for dinner and stayed for 20 years somewhere in Indiana? Have you looked at that question? What are you exactly doing with, this isn't a visa overstay, these are short-term passes that happens every day along the border, but seems to be as we do our fencing, as we do different types of things along the border, an increasing occurrence.
Sir, when people arrive at our ports of entry, first of all, they go through one of our primary officer booths. We do normally a name query of that individual. We also check the vehicle to see if there's anything in it. During that process, the officer will ask the individual questions about what their intentions are for coming into the United States, how long they expect to stay. On the southern border, there's the border crossing card that allows those individuals from Mexico to arrive, to come across, to stay up to 30 days, and to basically stay within a 25-mile zone, except for Arizona, which is 75. But the officer has a responsibility to ask the individual questions, and based on that discussion between the officer and the individuals, the determination is made on whether further questioning is needed or whether there's an acceptance at face value that the person is telling the truth, that they are going to a legitimate restaurant, that they are going to be returning back to Mexico when they complete their dinner. So it's a process that's in place. However, once that individual does go through our process and gets into the city of El Paso, there is no mechanism to validate whether that person has actually left the United States.
And there's no mechanism to see if they've gone to another part of the United States.
That's correct.
And Are you looking at a mechanism?
Well, there's obviously what we do along the various land border, southern border area. We do have specific stops where we have our Border Patrol agents who will stop vehicles and ask individuals for identification and determine if someone has basically misused the use of the card. We have the capabilities to work to make sure that individuals that receive an I-94 card do return, and if they don't return, they show up on our list as individuals who have not reported for returning, and then we determine what type of action to take based on risk management.
Do you check this with law enforcement around the United States?
The ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement Office, is responsible for...
I take back the question. I really want to focus on the border. Do you see this as becoming part of the U.S. visit program? That you have an exit for this type of, I'm going to dinner and I stayed for 20 years?
I think that that's exactly what we were looking for to do down the road, recognizing that there are a lot of technology issues with that.
Down the road, like a year, 3 years?
I would say that a couple of years.
If I can, again, we've looked at and we tested various technologies that might assist us in preventing or kind of uncovering what you've talked about. And frankly, what the technology says is we're not ready yet. But I think within a couple of years, as Bob suggests, we would have the ability probably for biographic checks. It's the challenge of biometrics. It's the challenge of taking a physical piece.
It is biometrics. Without biometrics, you're going to have all kinds of profiling and potential discrimination. Biometrics are real and non-discriminatory. Let me ask this question. We've just gone through a debate, I'm sure it's not going to end with the vote in the Senate today, about potentially giving millions of work permits. I presume that somebody from the administration has asked you to draw up a plan to implement how you would handle the exit part of the work permits and the interest part of the work permits. Do you have any documents that you have any question that anybody's asked you to develop that plan? Or was this just a pie-in-the-sky thing that a few people developed but haven't even talked to the people who'd have to implement it? Because clearly that falls directly on your shoulders, that it could not possibly work for the employers in my district to have work permits without a biometric indicator, because the whole problem here is if you don't have a biometric indicator, you're going to discriminate against the many refugees and legitimate Hispanic citizens in the United States because you don't know who really it is. And if you don't have a plan, we are setting up tremendous problems of identification.
I can tell you that I know that the department is looking at exactly what would be the enforcement plan, what would be the protocols, what type of cards would be utilized to try to address those concerns. I'm not a participant of that actual work group, but I know that that is important to us to make sure that if we move forward with any type of trusted worker program, that there's the capabilities to make sure that it's enforceable at our ports of entry.
So the answer is those of you who are running the program really haven't been included in this yet?
Our initial focus is on the air and the sea, notwithstanding the challenges and the need for having land.
Notwithstanding the fact that we're debating in Congress a millions of people program, you're focused on a few while we supposedly were having a realistic debate about millions. I mean, that's the frustration that some of us have. And you have to do air and sea. It's just that incrementally Congress needs to be matched up with what you're actually capable of delivering. I thank the gentlelady for allowing me the extra minute.
You're quite welcome, Mr. Souter. I now recognize Mr. Green from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the ranking member as well. This is indeed a necessary hearing, and I thank the witnesses for making yourselves available. I know that you have tough jobs. This is an enormous task that you've undertaken. So let us move quickly and talk about some of these very serious issues. Mr. Haidt is with a reputable agency. I assume that GAO is a reputable agency as you view agencies here on the Hill. He has made some statements that might be considered indictments by some. While I will not call them indictments, Mr. Haidt, out of respect for you and the agency, I will say that there are some very serious charges. And the question to each of you, Mr. Jackstra and Mr. Mockney, is do you agree with all that he has said? Mr. Mockney.
Mr. Height has been with the program for
If you
ever
would,
since I was.
let me just ask this of you, because I have little time, and many times when persons finish, I don't know whether they've said yes or no. Do you agree, I think that is something that you can say yes to, or disagree with what he said?
I agree with the recommendations he has provided to us.
Do you agree with his assessment?
I may not have used those same quotations that he used.
But would you agree with his assessment? 4 years, $250 million, no plan. Do you agree with his assessment?
Yes, from the information that we provided to GAO, I would agree that he would be able to make those statements because we have not provided the detail to him for him to evaluate the plan that we do have.
Mr. Jackstra, do you agree with his assessment?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you agree with his assessment, then the question becomes, how can we be assured that, because he talked in some detail about this being deja vu all over again, how can we be assured that this next generation of plans will be something that will give us much more than the previous generations, meaning we'll have something that we can perfect and have a system that works?
I will use a quote here, past is prologue. I think when we apply ourselves here and we have a plan and we have the backing of the department in order to execute that plan, then we will execute that plan. So when you look at what we did for entry, we have to have that same, and we'll have that same backing of the department in going forward, and so therefore I can commit to you that we will have a plan. There's a lot of heavy lifting to do, no doubt. We have to work with the airlines. We have to be funded.
Now, given that you say you have the plan, you just don't have it with you today, the question becomes, what timeline do you have within the plan that you have that you don't have with you? What is the timeline within that plan for implementation?
We will have, working with the airlines, we will have a biometric exit solution in place by December of 2008. That's the plan. In order to get to that plan, we have to do a series of things like publish interim rules. We have to get some comments from the airline industry. We have to publish final rules. But December of 2008 is when we're committing to having biometric exit stood up.
Now, does this mean that you will have the genesis of the program, or that you will have all of your revelations in place such that the program will function properly?
Again, the plan calls for a final rule to be issued in June of 2008.
A final rule?
Final proposed rule, which would lay out what the airlines have to do, what DHS has to do. And so after we go through an interim proposed rule, which is a comment period, we then take those comments from the airlines and from anybody who wants to comment on those proposed rules.
So in 2008, we won't have a final plan. We will have the beginning of the final plan?
In June of 2008, we will have the final plan, and then we have execution from June until December 2008. So you have complete exit control on biometrics at the air and the seaports of entry.
In December of 2008, we'll have the final plan in place?
No, June of 2008.
June of 2008, and then we take
6 months.
6 months to examine the final plan.
Correct, and have it executed. So deploy, after starting in June, we will then begin deploying the solution so that by December of 2008, we should have the biometric exit in place at the airports and the seaports where we would have it put in place. And some of the ones I mentioned in my opening testimony.
Thank you for the time, Madam Chair. I see that I've exceeded my time. Thank you very much.
Quite welcome, Mr. Green. Mr. Bilirakis, thank you for having been here from the start and for taking your turn. 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And I'd like to admit my opening statement to the record, Madam Chair, to save time,
So
in
ordered.
the best interest of time. Mr. Mockney, do you believe that establishing a fully functional entry and exit system, especially at land borders, is a prerequisite to establishing any type of amnesty or temporary guest worker program?
I couldn't comment on whether or not we should have it in place. I think it's going to be important for us to be able to tell whether people leave or not, but whether we can commit to an exit process in place at land border ports of entry as part of the temporary worker program, that's currently not something that I can comment on.
Okay, anybody else want to take a shot at that? Okay. Can we enforce time limitations, again, referring to this, on such guest workers or other visa holders in the absence of such a system? Can we, for the panel again?
You can't enforce what you don't know, and so if you don't have an exit process in place, whatever that be, biographic or biometric, you would know if in fact the person left, other than the I-94 that we might collect. But I do want you to understand that we're not abandoning that whole process. It's just a matter of what we can do in the time frame of what we're talking about. So we could have a biographic system in place, potentially by working with Canada, by working with Mexico. So it's not as if we're abandoning land border. It's simply something we can't sit here and testify today. This is the absolute solution for it, whether it be biometric or biographic at this point.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to point out the challenges that we place at the land border. I mean, I think it has to be recognized that the land border is an extremely difficult place for us to implement outbound compliance. Clearly, as we move forward with any type of program, we need to develop and look at the technologies that would be available. There might be opportunities for RFID, radio frequency cards. There might be the capabilities for biometrics. There might be capabilities for other methods, working with the foreign governments, as Bob mentioned, Canadians and Mexicans. So there are opportunities to build on, but clearly biometrics would be the most secure mechanism to ensure that people who came into the United States leave the United States.
Okay, next question. I mentioned in my opening remarks, which submitted for the record, about the MANA Pass initiative, in which the Coast Guard is using mobile technology to collect biometric information on apprehended migrants and comparing that information to the U.S. visit identification database to determine their identity. Would you briefly explain, Mr. Mockney, this effort, any results to date, and the potential for expanding the use of mobile biometrics collection as part of an exit solution?
Thank you. The Mona Pass project that you referred to with the Coast Guard, I think, represents where we have applied new technologies that have come to a maturity stage where we can use those. And simply put, what we're doing with the biometric devices is providing to the Coast Guard, who operate within the Mona Pass, which is a location in between Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, where people will take these YOLAs, where they're basically very rickety boats, to try and get into America, try to get into Puerto Rico. In the past, the Coast Guard would intercept a boatload of these individuals, knowing that they had seen these people before, maybe the week before, the month before, but they just had no basis because these people carry no identification or false identification. Working with the Coast Guard and using biometric mobile devices that they procured and working with our database, we now, in fact, in real time, using satellite communications, can identify people from these boats to the point where they had one prosecution last year, and they're up to 60-some prosecutions so far this year, where the Coast Guard has indicated that the normal flow of traffic in between the Mona Pass is down 50%. It is a clear indication of when you apply technology that is matured, that you can have a significant positive effect on illegal migration, and where this is not only a deterrent effect, but also a huge prosecution effect, working with the U.S. Attorney in the area, that this is something that we think has a lot of merit and a lot of application to other areas. Mobile technology will afford us the ability to capture biometrics and process and identify individuals in areas where we just can't do it today. And whether that actually applies into a car and land border is to be determined. But the idea of using mobile technology and applying that to the various locations, we believe will have a very positive effect, as it has in the Mona Pass.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you to the gentleman from Florida. Gentlemen, in the report on the House Homeland Security Appropriations Bill, provides $45 million in funding for TSA to implement the new document checker program to ensure that government employees and not airline employees are comparing passenger ID to passenger boarding. In other words, when you get to when you're at the airport and you're getting to security, you have someone checking to see your boarding pass matches your car, your whatever ID you're handing them. That traditionally has been an airline employee. Now they've decided they would prefer to have TSA employees do that. So at a time when we are actually doing something that simple, look at the person, see if the photo looks like them, check that name against this name. We're taking that away from the airline. Why would you be putting the visit-exit program in the laps of the airlines at the checkout or check-in process, at the check-in process?
For two reasons, and this is part of the thinking that went into coming up with a check-in process, which is the airlines, in effect, do that today. The airlines collect the I-94, the departure card, that card that the foreign national gets when they arrive in the U.S. So they hand the I-94, which says, this is Bob Mockney, and now I'm leaving the country. They're collected by the airline employees, and then they're turned over to Bob's people at the end of the day, where they're then matched and then sent to a location to be matched against the entry documents. The departure card is matched against the arrival card. That occurs today, and one of the things that we're asking the airlines to do is to take another data point, which is a finger scan of that individual. And the reason why we have set the check-in process is we have to make it known to the traveler. Again, one of the things that we learned within the pilots was that if there wasn't kind of uniformity to where one checks out, then one can often get confused. And where the TSA sounds attractive, it's a choke point, it's a DHS point, not all TSA locations are fit well into that particular airport. There are locations where they fit quite well, and there's a lot of extra space there. There's many airports and where TSA is rather shoehorned into a particular area there. And so if it can't be at all TSA points, it kind of can't be at any TSA points, because if they're at this airport, it's at TSA. If it's at another airport, it's behind TSA. And a third airport, it's before TSA. Where do I go to check out?
I'm not saying about TSA doing it. I'm saying if TSA thinks the airlines can't do a good job at just doing that little piece, then why would you think they would be able to do all of this other stuff? Why wouldn't an employee who's behind the counter just not look at those documents, for example?
Well, again, I'm not a TSA, I don't work with the TSA, but understanding that these were contractor people that the airports would hire, perhaps it was the airlines who would hire, it wasn't the check-in people who would do it themselves. I think one of the reasons why, again, that we believe that this is a rather simple thing to do is what we're asking the airlines to do is what we've been doing for the last 4 years. It's tried and true. It's simply as part of the process where they validate the passport, which they have to do by regulations. They have to touch a passport for anybody going in a foreign location. And so by touching the passport and validating that that's the person who that is, they then simply can take a finger scan of the individual as well. That's tried and true. We've been doing it at 3,000 points of inspection for the past 4 years. It's relatively easy. It's very quick. It's very fast. It's very efficient. And so we're trying to find the best fit, not just for DHS and for the airlines, but also keeping in mind the traveler has to be able to have some certainty as to where I check out. So it's a simple process for the airlines and to do. It's simply asking for a finger scan of the individual.
Mr. Sauter, do you have any questions?
I'd like to ask Mr. Hike a question.
Go ahead.
I take it that you have, I'm sorry I missed your testimony, but I take it that you have some skepticism given the subtitles here, which in itself are interesting. Despite expending considerable time and resources, U.S. visit-exit is not operational. Air and sea exit efforts have not been managed well. Land exit efforts have not produced a viable solution. Lack of definition and justification risk repeating past mistakes. So I think those are pretty strong statements. Now, in the discussion, first on air, just briefly, do you think, it seems to me that when a person checks in at the airport, that we would immediately have some kind of a computer system. We've had this question about the land border and the TB person. Isn't there a central check-in place where you just put your finger down, it would immediately trigger whether the person, not just at the airlines, the question of a backup, why isn't there a U.S. government backup system that catches when somebody's going to move in or out? Is that technologically not possible, what I'm asking, or is it just, what kind of investment are we looking at? It seemed to me that, for example, our National Targeting Center should have known immediately that that person who had TB was crossing a border crossing. I mean, this is the technology moves immediately through the air. It's not like it's some kind of it takes 3 days to float your check anymore.
Yes, sir. I appreciate the question. I would submit it's probably a better question to pose to the department as opposed to GAO.
That what I'm wondering is do you think that they feasibly could do something like that, or have you seen anything like that?
I have not seen anything like that. Based on my knowledge and experience, I don't think it would be technologically challenging. It may be operationally challenging, but I will admit that I'm not an expert on airport and airline operations.
You suggested some doubt, and you heard today that they're hoping to have this airport procedure operational in December 2008. Do you think that's realistic?
I haven't seen anything to give me any confidence to show that that's realistic. Throwing out dates like that are nice to have as goals. Having meaningful dates that you intend to meet are generated by virtue of the fact that you've thought through systematically what's it going to take to get us there, and you build those kind of schedules on a bottom-up basis, and therefore you have some confidence that you can in fact meet that. There's too many unknowns that haven't been answered yet, in my view, to even have any confidence as to an end date on this thing, the least of which is gaining the airlines' cooperation on this proposed solution. So I don't think they're at the point yet where they could give you a good, hard date that they would actually, I think, if I was in their situation, would want to be held accountable to.
And wouldn't you say similar that for the DHS or the Senator or anybody in the House to say that a land border entry-exit strategy would be in place in 3 to 5 years is a tad of an optimistic goal as opposed to a realistic implementation strategy?
All I can say is based on everything that I've seen, I haven't seen anything that would give me the basis for that. It certainly can be a stated goal, but there's a difference between a goal and a schedule that's been defined in a rigorous and disciplined fashion.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and in all fairness to U.S. Visit and to DHS, part of the problem is one of the variables here is the United States Congress, and that they'll state their goals, but they may not have adequate money with which to implement their goals. And if we're going to be realistic about what's the difference between a goal and an implementation strategy, we have to make sure there's adequate money for the technology, that we have to make sure there's adequate money for the development of these procedures, for the hiring of people to implement it. And we've been a tad inconsistent on our side and then say, why isn't it being done? But to do that, the administration has to actually come forward with realistic numbers and say, look, this isn't a couple of $1 billion. We're looking at systems that are incredible amounts of money, and probably that can't be done in a very short period. It's going to take a little bit. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sutter. At this time, I'll recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank the ranking member for his last comments. I do think that we need a greater degree of cooperation from the administration in terms of what is realistic with the numbers. And I compliment you and I thank you. Just quickly, if we use biometric detection at the counter with the airline employee, is that where we are talking about at check-in?
We're looking at the check-in process, and so where much of that happens at the counter, they're now moving to kiosks as well, and so we want to look at how we might implement a finger scanner in a kiosk.
At the point you are using the biometric detection, I assume that the visitor will receive some sort of document at this point if this proves to be the correct person.
That is what we use for the pilot, where there's a receipt that was printed out, but what we'd like to be able to do is work with the airlines to incorporate that into the boarding pass process. So the boarding pass would in fact be a receipt that says this person now has had their document checked as appropriate and has the finger scan.
That person does not immediately, if we are at an airport, board a plane. The person then has the freedom to move about through the airport before boarding the plane?
That's correct.
What then prevents the person, and I'm sure you have the answer, I just don't see it. What prevents a person from giving this document to another person who has some fraudulent ID and then boarding the plane if you've already now had your biometric detection and you've given the person freedom of mobility?
We've asked ourselves that question. In fact, during the pilots, we actually tested an ability to validate someone who had already gone through the finger scan process. So there is technology that would allow a secondary scan to take place at the boarding gate. There is other technology that would allow us to vet the name of the people. When they close out the final record, the departure control system, there's a list of people who actually boarded the plane. We can vet that name with the fingerprints and the names taken at the time that they were finger scanned at the counter at the kiosk. But again, those are the details that we want to work with the airlines to find the best that fits into the best model that fits into their business model as well.
But your paradigm creates a certain amount of dubiety. It creates a certain amount of consternation, because the question becomes, why perform what is the best check at the check-in and then some secondary or tertiary that is not the best? Why not perform the best check at the point where the person is about to board the plane, as opposed to at the point of checking in?
Again, you raise all very good and valid points. We've got these three basic areas where we see people: at the check-in, at the TSA, and then at the boarding gate. The airline's been very successful in getting DHS away from the boarding gate when TSA was doing secondary checks and kind of messing up their boarding process, delaying planes and such.
I understand, but now we have a country to protect. And I respect the opinions of the airlines, but the best place to check the person for boarding a plane is at the point where the person is about to board the plane. That premise is almost undeniable. Would you agree?
I wouldn't disagree, other than when you say the best, it is an issue of we have to factor in anything that we do, the economic effect that we have on what the industry does. And in fact, yes, we have to protect America, but we also have to respect the fact that we have an airline industry that moves millions.
But won't you have the same problem at the check-in that you will have at the boarding point? How does it differ at the boarding point as opposed to the point of checking in? How does it differ in terms of time?
We ask people to show up for check-in at least 2 hours, 2.5 hours before they're going to go international. Generally, at the boarding gate, you have maybe half an hour, as few as 10 minutes.
But your biometric read is something that takes less than 5 seconds. You do the biometric read, you have your boarding pass, you enter.
Right.
Okay. I've been to Singapore where they use these biometrics. In fact, I believe the chair lady was with. Were you on that Codell of Singapore? Okay. They do this, and they have people who walk through and they scan, and it happens almost instantaneously, and it's a very, very expedited process, very much so. I'm really appealing to you to consider the best point of detection at the port of entry to the plane or to the ship or to wherever it is the person is going to whatever vehicle the person will traverse on. It just seems to me that giving a person a license to roam freely after having gone through detection gives a person also the license to fraudulently board or give someone else the opportunity to fraudulently board an aircraft.
And I appreciate that, and we will take all those issues into consideration. I think, as we say, the check-in process, we want to hear from the airlines, what is the check-in process of the future? How do you take the individual from outside the airport to getting on board the plane? And so we want to understand all those different steps along the way. And if whatever is the best for the security of the U.S. and works with the airlines and works for the travelers so they're not confused, we want to implement those programs.
Thank you, Mr. Green. I'll now recognize Mr. Cuellar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 3 sets of questions. First question has to do with the deadlines. I think, Mr. Hite, you were mentioning this about having realistic, and this applies to all 3 of y'all, but you have the agency that has a particular idea of what certain timetables should be. Then you have Congress that has a certain idea of what a timetable should be, a dateline as to when we ought to implement a particular project, or in this case, let's say talk about U.S. visit, exit. How should we try to work closer together and trying to come up with something more realistic? Because, I mean, anybody can say, do it by January 5th of 2008, no matter what. Whether that's realistic or not, that might be questionable. But how do we work out something where we could try to get more realistic dates, taking everything in consideration? But then at the same time, I mean, I know you got to look at, well, how do we implement this? But at the same time, we get the outside pressures of saying we got to provide something for the security of the nation. What's your thought process on how we ought to come up with a more realistic timetables when we're working on legislation? Whoever wants to go first.
I think by having the back and forth that we've been having, and by asking for reports that basically say, understand the complexity of what you have to do. Congress says you have to do X by, and sometimes not by a certain date. We've never been given a date certain to do exit. When we were given a date certain to do entry, December 31st, 2003, 2004, 2005, we met or beat every one of those dates. Those were often seen as perhaps not realistic, but we applied ourselves and we applied resources, and we were able to get those dates met. So I think then now having, and with entry, I want to say it was easy. That's using that term a little bit loosely. Exit, we don't have the infrastructure. That's part of the issue. You don't have booths like manned staff booths that Bob has. So with exit, we have to create that infrastructure or utilize the infrastructure that's out there. So by having us look across the board and saying, here's the challenge and here's what we don't have, here's what we think we need to do, coming back to the Congress and submitting a realistic plan. I think we've suggested that with the land border. I think we're here basically committing, saying it's not possible in our minds to come up with a biometric solution for the land border at this point. But should we study that and look at what is possible and when is that possible? So I think we have enough information, enough experience in our history to say this is possible, this is not possible. And that's why we're up here confident saying biometric exit at the land border is not possible within 2 years. Biometric exit within the airports within 2 years, we believe is possible in the cruise lines. We have that history. So by having a dialogue, and whether it's a report sent up or having your able staff up here working with us, then we're able to craft the appropriate legislation and then appropriate appropriations to be able to fund those, because that's the key to any of this is as Congressman Souder mentioned, is the funding behind what we have to do. And so I would simply say continue the dialogue, and sometimes it's in the form of a formal report, which we're happy to do, to kind of outline what our plans are.
So this type of oversight committee hearings or informal meetings with staff or whatever, those type of communications would be very helpful.
They've been very helpful to us for the past 4 years, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, I can give you examples of the passports issue. As you know, we saw what happened, and then of course the U.S. visit exit also, and again, not even getting to the land ports. I don't want to go into that. You know how I feel about that, but yeah, we just need to continue having this type of dialogues, because I mean, I'm not the type to say just set up a timetable. So once we get to it, it wasn't realistic, and then we have to delay it again for another period of time. So we appreciate if you can just continue working with the committee to help us on this type of timetables on that.
Absolutely.
I got about 50 seconds. Jackson and Mr. Hyde, any thoughts on that? On how do we establish that communication so make sure we get realistic timetables?
Yes, sir. What I would offer is that on any program, what you're trying to do is to introduce a certain capability, and that capability is functions, and it's how well you execute functions by a certain time at a certain cost to produce a certain benefit. All four of those legs on that table need to be balanced against one another, because if you give me less time, I can give you less capability and less benefit, and maybe I'll get it done cheaper. But it all depends on what you want, and that's why there needs to be agreement around what is the outcome we're trying to achieve. If the outcome is the important thing, which I think it is, it drives capability, it drives timelines, it drives cost, and then you can make an informed judgment as to whether or not that outcome is worth the cost.
Yeah,
you've got to approach it that way.
You're right. The result is what we're interested in. What sort of inputs we put in, and we'll determine that. But my time's up.
Can I just answer? You asked
yes.
the question. I just wanted to say that we are working on this. One of the things that is extremely important for us is to have this dialogue and to be here. Although at times it could be painful, it's good to have a discussion about what some of the issues may be. And we've had a number of discussions with your staffs about what we are trying to do on this. We've had a number of discussions with the carriers. We have a number of discussions with the stakeholders on the land border. This is a complex issue that we make every effort to hear about what we can do to make it work for both of us, because it's a mutual concern. We all want to have security. We all want to have facilitation. How we get there is built on those discussions that take place. And so I know why we were so successful with the entry part of it was that we did have those discussions. We did have the outreach efforts, and we'll continue to do that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank the chairman. I thank the gentleman. Mr. Height, before we let you go, your report is pretty sad, actually. And throughout the report, you continue to state pretty much that there doesn't seem to be a cost-benefit analysis really going on, that there's no justification for the money spent. Really, the end product is never gets there, or is evolving, or going back to your whole idea of what are you spending your money on, and the whole accountability issue. Is that because the department wasn't forthcoming with enough information for you to determine whether they had made plans, hit milestones, or is it because they don't seem to have plans to be able to hit milestones, that they're sort of just groping in the dark?
The short answer is yes. I think it's a combination of both of those. We have seen an absence of definition, frankly, with entry as well, but primarily with exit, as to what are you going to deliver, what capability, what kind of functionality, how well is it to perform, by when, at what cost, and to achieve what outcomes, and how are you going to measure whether or not you're achieving those outcomes. And before you proceed, is it worth it? Is the solution that you're proposing to give these capabilities, is it worth the investment? Or is there another solution that's more cost beneficial? These are all principles that are applied to any new program that you're developing. Frankly, it's a principle you apply to any investment that an individual is going to make in their home, or any individual who's a business owner is going to make. You invest in something to provide value, so you need to know what that value is going to be, and you need to be able to know how much it's going to cost you over its intended life cycle, and when it's going to get done. And so what we found, and the testimony that you described as sad, has been a pattern of that over the course of U.S. visit. We've said it's difficult to hold the department accountable for U.S. visit because it's never really been clear what U.S. visit is or what U.S. visit will be when it grows up. So again, the answer is it's been a combination of the two, the lack of definition, and then what we, in sharing with us what definition does in fact exist, and what we've seen, limitations in that.
Thank you, Mr. Height. Going back to Mr. Mockney, just for the last question. We talked earlier about how you have a plan. You have a plan. The chairman sent you a letter, and he said, various questions, and now you say you have a plan. It's in writing, certainly not in a binder altogether. It seems to be pieces from what I could get out of your testimony earlier to me. I have your response back to the chairman here. It's sad also, by the way, this response. So my question to you, I'm assuming you read the GAO report that Mr. Height and the GAO put out.
Is this the GAO report on the U.S. visit spend plan? I'm not sure I have.
I believe you're referring to our testimony.
Prospects for biometric U.S. visit exit capability remain unclear.
Today's testimony.
I have not seen the report. No.
You have not seen the report. I would ask you to take a look at page 10 when you go back. You don't need to now. But one of the things that Mr. Height and his group says is that no exit program plans are available that define what will be done, by what entities, and at what cost to define, acquire, deliver, deploy, and operate this capability. including plans describing expected systems capabilities, defining measurable outcomes, identifying key stakeholders, roles, responsibilities. The list goes on, life cycle costs, et cetera, et cetera. I think I agree with Mr. Haidt. I think this is the kind of plan that we want to see on this committee. So his description of what he thinks would be a good plan sits squarely on page 10. I hope you'll go back and read the report, and that when we get your plan, that it answers to that. Thank you, gentlemen, for testifying before us today. And I welcome the second panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. James May, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Air Transport Association. Prior to joining ATA, Mr. May served as Executive Vice President of the National Association of Broadcasters. He's held a variety of other senior positions in public affairs and government relations. Welcome, Mr. May. And our second witness will be Ms. Anna Satorio, Associate Director for Governmental Affairs for the Miami-Dade Aviation Department, operator of the Miami International Airport and 4 general aviation airports. And she directs the department's legislative and regulatory affairs at the local, state, and federal levels. She also serves as the chair of the Airports Council International North American Facilitation Group. So without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record. And I will now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes. Tell us what you think is most important. We'll begin with Mr. May, please.
Today. There we go. You'd think I hadn't done this before. As you know, Congress mandate for the federal government to collect information on visitors departing from the United States isn't new. In 1996, Congress first directed the government, I would point out, to develop an automated entry and exit control system to collect biographical information on visitors arriving in and departing from the United States. As you might not know, today is not ATA's first appearance on this subject. In January of '04, following yet another congressional mandate for the federal government to collect the information, including, at that point, biometrics on arriving and departing visitors, I complimented DHS and the U.S. Visit Program on the U.S. Visit Entry Program. Those compliments, I think, are well-deserved. As they have in many other contexts, DHS and the airlines work together to implement that entry program in a collaborative, systemic process. And without a doubt, the government's successful operation of entry at 115 different airports is due to that collaboration. Now, in 2004, having had limited involvement with the exit pilot programs, I urged the continuation of this partnership. Airlines were looking forward to working with DHS on exit. DHS, however, chose not to consult further with ATA or the airlines and not to even share the results of the exit pilot programs. Now, despite their assurances, there was no government-industry partnership from the conclusion of those pilot programs in December of '05 through December of '06. Then in January of this year, there was sort of a rapprochement, if you will, and we were told again, sure, we're going to work with you. Unfortunately, in March, we learned that DHS had made a unilateral decision, and that was that airlines, not the government, would collect biometrics at check-in counters. They explained the decision fit the DHS business plan. I think it's unfortunate for a couple of reasons. Number one, in addition to noting their sort of unexplained failure to continue consulting with it, there are two principal issues. First, you and the Congress have made it abundantly clear 6 times since 1996 that you want the federal government to implement this program. They do it with the entry program. They do it with all sorts of other border control activities. It is a law enforcement function, and it ought to be the government that executes this plan. After all, DHS and its counterparts are the relevant agency. Further, I think the exit process should mirror the entry process. Now, our second objection relates to our business plan. Years ago, the airline industry adopted a business model that focuses on moving passengers away from the ticket counter in an unnecessary procedures. The goal was and is today to facilitate passengers' processing, making check-in processes as efficient and seamless as possible. Today, due to considerable investment by airlines and obvious time savings, over 30% of all of our passengers check in electronically, and that number is growing every day. Kiosks are just an interim step in the process. Kiosks are an interim step in the process and are going to disappear from airports as passengers check in via cell phones, PDAs, and home computers. Now, I'm showing you what amounts to, it's hard to see from this distance, a barcode on my Trio. I can receive that electronically. I can let it get scanned at the check-in point, the security checkpoint. I can let it get scanned again at the gate, and boom, I'm taken care of. That's the kind of technology that we're working on. We're exploring the ways that allow passengers like each of you and all of your colleagues, as you're crossing the 14th Street Bridge and you're racing to catch that plane because you want to get back to the district for the weekend, to check in via cell phone or your Trio. And if, as DHS proposes, passengers are required to forget all this wonderful new technology, go to the ticket counter, and at that point the airlines themselves are required to collect biometrics during the check-in process, then this whole efficient, seamless off-airport passenger check-in is going to disappear. And I promise you, for any of you who have been to the check-in counters, Dulles Airport, National Airport, I'm sure Miami-Dade, the lines can be long and very, very cumbersome. Closing, let me make one final salient point. We've invested millions of dollars reconfiguring our systems to comply with a program you heard about earlier, Advanced Passenger Information, APIS, and on passport reconciliation requirements to collect biographical data on passengers. We are committed and working with DHS to spending millions more on implementing what's called AQQ and Secure Flight, 2 more programs. Finally, we're preparing to invest even more on wireless technologies, as I've just demonstrated to you, to collect, to supplement all of the biographical information that we're currently collecting and sharing with DHS and its many agencies. So we don't oppose the U.S. visit program. We want to collaborate and continue to collaborate with DHS as possible, but we want it to be done in a way that makes sense for all of us, and quite frankly, the easiest, simplest place to have it be the government that does it and have a one-stop shopping center is to do it at the checkpoint. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. May. And now, Ms. Sotorio.
Apologize. Thank you, Chairwoman Sanchez and Ranking Member Souter, for the opportunity to testify today on this important subject. I am appearing today not only in my capacity as Associate Director of Government Affairs for Miami-Dade Aviation Department, operator of Miami International Airport, but also as Chair of the Airports Council International North America Facilitation Working Group. ACI-NA represents the local, regional, and state governing bodies that own and operate commercial service airports. The association's member airports employ more than 95% of the domestic and virtually all the international airline passenger and cargo traffic in North America. The ACI Facilitation Working Group addresses issues related to international passenger inspection and facilitation programs and regulations, interfacing with various Homeland Security agencies. ACI-NA recognizes the need for an accurate biometric exit system and fully supports its implementation at air, sea, and land points of departure. In order to be effective, the system must be integrated into the traveler's normal departure process and implemented in full consultation with industry stakeholders. The system must also take into account existing infrastructure and passenger flows at each airport. For about 2 years, U.S. Visit conducted a pilot program which mainly focused on kiosks to collect biometric information of departing international visitors at 12 airports and 2 seaports, including the Port of Miami. In the pilot airports, kiosks were placed in the secure area after the screening checkpoint. The expectation was that the passenger would use the kiosk and then proceed to their departure gate and board their flight. There was good communication between U.S. Visit and the industry during the rollout phase of the pilot. While officials from the U.S. Visit program did provide some notice of the termination of the pilots to the airports involved, little information on the program has been shared. U.S. Visit has stated that the technology for collecting the biometrics was successful, but that the compliance rates were lower than expected. ACI-NA is disappointed that there was no formal debriefing or sharing of information during the pilot or on the final report prepared by U.S. Visit Office in December 2005 on the effectiveness of the pilot program. With such limited data, we are unable to fully evaluate the pilot program or make recommendations for improvement. ACI-NA has heard from numerous airport officials that they were not surprised at the reported low compliance rate, as travelers had to seek out the kiosks because they were not integrated into the existing passenger flow. It is clear that any successful future program must be incorporated at a location through which passengers must proceed. Again, there has been little collaboration with the airport community on the DHS current plan to place the exit process at airline check-in counters. This proposal is strongly opposed by the airlines. Most importantly, ACI-NA is concerned the inherently governmental function of immigration and border control is to be abdicated to private industry. The collection of entry or exit information from passengers has always been a federal responsibility, and no compelling reason has been provided for change. U.S. Visit must engage in thorough and meaningful consultations with airports and airlines to determine the most efficient method and location for collection of a traveler's biometric as they exit the country. Such a collaborative process is necessary as the exit program presents potential problems in accommodating both equipment and staff into airports where unfunded federal mandates have already claimed premium space. Unfortunately, unlike airports in most other parts of the world, U.S. airports were not designed or built to accommodate passenger departure controls. We would also stress that customer service must be considered in designing an effective U.S. visit-exit program. Numerous organizations have recently documented the important economic contribution of international travel for both the aviation industry and the U.S. economy as a whole. International airline passengers, like domestic travelers, are already experiencing record delays and inconvenience, and we should ensure that any new system does not further complicate the travel process. ACI-NA and our member airports look forward to working with DHS and its agencies, including the U.S. Visit Program Office, as well as industry partners, to ensure that the exit elements of U.S. Visit actually enhance both U.S. security and travel. We appreciate the subcommittee's interest in this important issue and look forward to working with you to accomplish our mutual goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. And I now recognize myself for some questions. Can you both describe the difference between what the airlines experienced in terms of partnership and coordination with the department on the U.S. visit exit component and what you think should have happened?
You want to go first? You want me to?
What we would have liked to see is a true partnership where we could have worked collaboratively with not just U.S. Visit, but also with the airlines in identifying and developing the optimal solution. There was that type of communication, I think, early on, but somehow that was not followed through after the conclusion of the pilots. And so, therefore, at this point, we find ourselves with very little data upon which to base any recommendations.
Ditto. And beyond that, look, we ran a couple of DHS ran some pilot projects. As my colleague here has said, they then didn't share with us the results of those pilot projects. They sort of came to the conclusion, because it, quote unquote, fit their business plan, that they wanted to unilaterally establish that this should be done by carriers at our check-in counters. Well, that, as I've testified, runs very counter to our business plan. There was never a pilot done to see what the dynamics of that process would be like, and it was almost a unilateral sort of fait accompli that was going to be the way it worked. We have worked with DHS and TSA on countless programs. We're working with them on APIS. We're working with them on AQQ and Secure Flight. The reality is, and I think the committee already understands this, if the goal is to collect information on who's in and who's out of the country, a lot of that information is already being collected via the APIS program. The biometric is going to refine that process a little bit. And the other thing you need to know is this isn't a go, no-go program. This is just a collection effort. It doesn't say, and it sort of reflects back on the congressman's questions on the other side, is how do you know it's the right person? We really don't know the answer to that. We know that we're collecting biometric information, and the comparisons are not being done prior to these individuals departing on whatever flight they're going to depart on. So I think there are lots and lots of issues that need to be discussed, resolved, costs, but at the end of the day, it is a law enforcement function. That's what this Congress has told DHS on 6 different occasions. Homeland 9/11 Commission agrees. And secondly, it can't interfere with the business plans. We've got great plans to facilitate people through the process far more efficiently. This runs directly counter to that. And if somebody had come to us and said, gee, what do you think about doing it at the counter? That's exactly what we would have said at that point as well. So we think doing it at the checkpoint is the best place to do it. The reason they're changing out those people who are checking documents has a basis in security concern. And we think that if you've got qualified, trained people there, that's the best place to have the process.
Mr. May, I have the letter. Mr. Thompson, the chairman, sent a letter asking various questions about, in particular, the exit.
I saw his
piece of U.S. visit, and the department's answer back to how have you all been talking, basically? How did you inform, actually, how did you inform the stakeholders? Their answer back was that they had been in contact with industry stakeholders regarding the development of a new process for collecting biometric exit data. And in addition to informal conversations, DHS officials formally discussed the vision of a biometric exit system with groups of airline industry representatives at 4 detailed level meetings this year. Are you aware of those?
I'm not personally aware of all of them. I wouldn't have personally attended. I'm sure my staff have. I can verify for you that we have had, very formal meetings with DHS on this subject, as we have on a lot of other subjects. But the one that counts most is when we had a meeting with them and were informed that they had made a business decision and this was going to be the plan.
And when did they inform you or inform the stakeholders of that?
If memory serves, sometime in February or March of this year, where they made a unilateral decision. And we've had such a wonderful cooperative relationship with them over the years. It just sort of was out of character a little bit more than anything else. And I want to maintain that relationship. From a security standpoint, we think U.S. visit exit is very important. We've got to find a way to help get that done, as we have with all the other programs.
The department is considering different ways to support air carriers in the implementation of the U.S. visit exit program. Some of the things they've mentioned have been financial or technical assistance. What type of support could you use from the department? What's most needed and useful to airlines?
What airlines most need is for the DHS to accept and understand, as Congress has directed, that this is a governmental function, it is a law enforcement function, it is an immigration function, and ought to be conducted by qualified officers of the department, not by counter personnel or other personnel employed by the airlines.
Mr. Torrio, would it affect your airport?
What? I'm sorry.
Would you, with this, how they plan on collecting it? How is it going to affect your functions?
Well, for example, Mr. May suggested that the process should occur at the checkpoints. We're not closed to that idea. I mean, we would be open to exploring that idea, but we would certainly have concern because many airports, including mine, already have very tight footprints for those checkpoints. They're very congested places. And quite frankly, I'm not sure where you would put that process in a checkpoint. So, perhaps there is a way to make it work. I'm not saying it can't work, but there certainly hasn't been enough, analysis done to say that, with any kind of definity that really can work.
Thank you. Mr. Souter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I am wrestling with a couple of questions with this. I fundamentally don't see the bright line distinction on law enforcement and the other, but I think you've also made a compelling case about why there needs to be consultation, because the question is, to me, the law enforcement function is if you have somebody you need to detain or hold, that clearly becomes law enforcement function. But for clearance, I don't see that. It partly becomes an efficiency question in the airport where that's going to occur, because some airports have tremendously jammed Homeland Security areas, others have it at the gate, and some others have it at some of the ticket entry points. I thought your point, Mr. May, was tremendous about watching how I've behaved. I still tend to like more of the hard tickets versus my son, who I think if he ever uses another hard ticket will feel he's failed technologically. And the kiosks took a little while to check in, but now you can do it on your home computer, and this cell phone change is huge. Clearly, I doubt if that really hit anybody. What I'm wondering is how much of this is over cost, because even if the law enforcement function does go to the degree it's called law enforcement function, to the airline desk, either the gate, I thought Mr. Green made a tremendous point, whether it's at the gate or whether it's the check-in desk, to some of this is just a technological question, because the little reader that goes through and scans, clearly where we're headed is to have a biometric indicator on that. And so if you have your systems networked, like computers should be networked, where it is scanned, or even multiple times, it can happen when you check in, it can happen at the Homeland Security place, and at the gate for that matter, to make sure that you aren't having changes. That I have a heavy manufacturing area that does a lot of defense electronics, and I've looked at the models that are being developed, some under DHS. I happen to have the 3 largest companies that make driver's licenses, for example. The biggest does 37 states plus Singapore, and I scan a lot of international, but total 46 or 47 out of the 50 states licenses are done in my home area. And they have all kinds of flexibility. It's just a question of what people are willing to pay for them within them. There is a company that is working with Homeland Security, but right now with CIA, DIA, and certain key installations where you just take your badge. I mean, it's like a movie. You take your badge and you go through, and you might have to put your finger on it, but we're not there yet. Right. And the question is how do we get there, and who's going to pay for it? But I don't necessarily accept the assumption that this can't be done at the check-in or at any given place. It really is a question of how easy the technology is and how fast the technology is. Do you disagree with that, either of you, or comment on that?
Listen, we're always interested in the bottom line, so I could never with a straight face tell you that money doesn't enter into the issue. I would also quickly point out to you, we're investing millions of dollars right now on TSA, DHS compliant programs, that many of which are tied very closely to this. My driver's license, as I'm sure your driver's license does, has a magnetic swipe on the back. That contains biometric information, fingerprint, photo. It's on there. If we're using that same kind of technology that gets scanned at the TSA checkpoint, and again, for the sake of argument, at the gate as you board the plane, in lieu of that paper or even electronically printed out boarding pass, we've accomplished a lot to get people to do that. I think many of these technologies and tasks are going to be merged in the future. But it seems to make sense to me, and I understand my colleague from ACI's perspective because I travel through a lot of those airports. It seems to me that if we've got a reasonably well-trained person who is going to stop you in line, take a look at your identification and your ticket or your boarding pass, compare those, that at the same time, if you're a foreign national and are so required, you put 2 fingers in a reader, which is right there, that is collecting that information, and it is a seamless process. And we know, and I think the GAO witness talked about the fact that what needs to happen is to have it be a collection point, if you will, where you can run those folks through. Gates have been one alternative, but as you know, you could have literally hundreds of gates in an airport, some of the larger airports, and that would require reading equipment at many locations beyond that which it can be done at the TSA checkpoint. I'd like to have that all be, centralized and coordinated. But again, I think it points out the importance of working with ACI and ATA and others to establish the real business imperatives from our side as well.
If I can make this last comment, I mean, RFID technology, for example, Walmart is now one of the things that working in the narcotics area, they're splitting up. They're able to tell whether, when they have these loads of pseudoephedrine or things moving in their trucks, whether it has been broken into and whether certain pills are missing.
We're using that same technology to check security for cargo and RFID to track baggage.
We are near breakthroughs and quantity breakthroughs that are going to change this whole field because we cannot have work permits, we cannot deal with visa overstays, I know a number of states have started to use fingerprints, but they don't have any scanners that are affordable. You have to have scanners like they're starting to do for stolen Visa cards and everything else at different places. We're going to see this technology just mushroom. I believe we're on the edge of getting a scanner that can do biometric at $7 to $10. When it's $7 to $10, it doesn't matter how many. I mean, it matters a little, but it's peanuts when you're talking the gates, where you're at, because you need to have it in the police car when they pick up somebody. You need to have it. One new challenge I had on work permits that I never thought of is the direct marketing people are very concerned that in employment, how is this going to affect Mary Kay? How is this going to affect Discovery Toys, Amway? Every time you have a party and there's some people there and one of them going to be a salesperson, you're going to have to scan them to see that they're legal. Well, you're not going to have big machines that cost thousands of dollars. You're going to have something that's 7 to 10 that can check into a system. We're getting near that. We don't have it, and then it's going to take us a while to implement and get all the IDs. And the question is how do we get through this interim period without totally disrupting air traffic and yet keeping America safe? And that's, I believe we have an interim challenge, and then we have a longer term. And you certainly should be at the table in the middle of this to figure out these variations.
We agree. I would simply note for you that having the hardware to accomplish those tasks at a very low price doesn't always cover the fact that the impact on software for our system is critically important, because these are our systems that you're talking about, and then we have to find ways to connect and transmit that information back to DHS, TSA, whoever the agency may be.
That's true, and that's where we may get into what's the law enforcement and what's not
Right.
law enforcement. Thank you.
Were you both in here when we had the three gentlemen beforehand? What's your understanding of what would happen in the proposed system that they were talking about? What's your understanding of what would be the responsibility of an air carrier?
If I interpreted correctly of what they intend for their plan, I have no reason at this stage of the game, although I'd like to have reason, that it's any different than the announcement they made to us earlier this year that it would be a plan executed at the check-in counters of airlines and run by airline personnel. I would like to think that that is not a final plan. I've seen some documentation from DHS that leaves open that question, and I think we ought to have, more discussions on that point. This may be heretic, but I think the Congress ought to ask, given the huge advances in technology that we're on the cusp of, given the fact we're collecting huge amounts of biometric data right now, given the fact you're going to have even more demands from an immigration perspective on land borders, et cetera, it may be that instituting a modest delay on some of these collection efforts for biometric and instead relying more heavily on biographic might not be a bad practical solution to some of the issues that have been raised here.
I'm sorry, if you have any comment on that, and more importantly, if you just give us an indication of every time we make a change, I'm assuming, I go through a lot of airports. I haven't been through yours in a bit, but every time we make a change, everything has to be redone at the airport. Different lines, different corridors. Who pays for all that?
Well, thank you. Yes. Unfortunately, many of these costs fall on the airport operator, and of course, ultimately, our bills are mostly paid by the airlines. So, and the airlines, I think, are in the business to make a buck. So, if you take that all the way down, it's the ultimate consumer. So the passenger is really paying for these improvements. We in Miami are in the midst of a $6.2 million billion with a B, Capital Development Program. So there's an awful lot of construction taking place, and we're constantly having to shift airlines, relocate ticket counters, do a whole series of moves in order to accommodate the construction. So that's something also to keep in mind. It's not just when you start a new process, but also initiating these new processes in the middle of an environment that's very dynamic and constantly, in flux as well.
Well, I can certainly appreciate that. In the last 7 years, I think they've been constructing Dulles or reconstructing it,
Yes.
and that's only a $3 billion capital project, so I can imagine you're going to have twice as many headaches. Anyway, thank you both for being before us and for your valuable testimony, and also the members for their questions, and the members of the subcommittee may have additional questions. Some of them, it's been a very busy week, so I apologize for not having the entire membership here, but we'll ask you if they have questions to respond in writing. We hope it'll be quick so that we can continue our oversight. And hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you.
No problem. You had a good stand in there.
Yes, it was. Thank you. It is so nice to have an issue to work with my friends with the airlines with